I'm Roger Krakow Sr., and this is my World War II story. First, I think that we should go through, for those who are not born before 1940, December 7th, 1941, we should tell what happened before in the world. Well, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and in a very short time, conquered Poland. Then in May 10th, in about 3 months, Germany invaded France and conquered it. Then in September 1940 to May 1941, Germany had a big blitz on, bombed the hell out of London. And what we in Iowa heard about this, there was no mass television. We heard from London, Edward R. Murrow every night would have a war report. But that's the only thing we got. If we wanted any pictures, we'd have to go to the theater, and they had RKA News and the theater. Every theater would have a 15-minute news section. But that's the only video, and so really far, far away. Europe was 6 or 7 hours, 6 or 7 days by boat. Planes, of course, weren't flying over the ocean then. And so it was somebody else's problem. Now in September 10th, 1940, we saw the war clouds coming, so we enacted the draft law so that every young man between 21 and 45 had to register and for the draft. And they started drafting a very small number. And we were very divided in America, just like we are now. Those who wanted to go to war, wanted to go and do more, and those who said, it's a European war, keep out of it. And as a matter of fact, on the day before Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh was a strong American first, and he was giving his speech at Yale, and going, keep out of the war, keep out of the war. And about half the country felt that way. In the draft bill, it only passed by one vote, and so you can tell how divided it was. At the time, at December 7th, 1941, we had 2 million people in the armed forces, 2 million total. At the height of the war in 44 and 45, we had 16 million. Now, one of the big things you have to think about is how you could go from 2 million to 16 million in a very short time, build all the bases, have the uniforms, have the transportation, get all the ammunition, build the tanks, build the planes. It was just a very, very big operation. When you think about, I'm thinking about myself, the first plane, the Wright brothers, was 20 years after I was born, the first plane flew. So that's how new the airplane is. My first flight in an airplane was in 1939. I flew from Moline, Illinois to Iowa City, Iowa to visit my brother Al, who's at the University of Iowa. It was United Airlines DC-2 before the DC-3. Going on for my situation, I grew up in Davenport, Iowa, a town about the size of San Mateo. I had it was during the Depression. We bought day-old bread. I had my hair cut at the Barber College. I wore secondhand clothes from my older brothers, but this is the way it was. And as the time went on, I went to high school. I had a great high school. We have one high school in Davenport. We were the state champs in basketball for a couple of years.
War story.
And everybody, of course, was in the ROTC then. And I graduated from high school. And my senior year in December, Pops was going to go to Mexico with the Texas Hotel Association. So he was very nice to take me along. And so we were in San Antonio, Texas on December 7th, 1941. And as we were leaving the hotel on Sunday afternoon, the newspapers were hawking, "Oh, the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor." Well, in those days, where in the hell is Pearl Harbor? Nobody, it was just far, far away. Well, we went to Mexico for a couple of weeks and we came back and I finished my high school year and I was all set to go to Cornell. In August, middle of August, I hadn't heard from Cornell. And so we called, they said, "Well, your high school grades are not good enough. Go to Iowa State and and then after a year you can transfer." So I went to Iowa State, which was a great time. And I joined the ROTC, the Field Artillery. And on December 12th, the nice major, very, very charming young man, said, "You know, boys, here's a hell of a deal. We will go and pay your way at Iowa State for 3 years. At the end of the 3-year period, you have to agree at Iowa State and you'll be a second lieutenant in the Field Artillery." And they said, "We need officers in the Army, and so this would be a good situation." So we all signed up December 12th, 1942. And so this was great. Well, what could be better? Well, what could be better is that on February 1st, they sent me a letter to report April 6th at Camp Dodge, Iowa, which was quite a shock, but that's the way the Army does. So on April 6th, Pops dropped me off at Fort Dodge, Camp Dodge, Iowa, an old World War I camp, muddy streets, old barracks. And we spent 2 or 3 days at Camp Dodge. They took our physical exam. We took medical exams and lots of other details. We got our uniforms, and we didn't know what we go from here. Well, after about 3 days, they put us on a train and said, "You're going to the Air Force." Well, my gosh, as I'm going back in the spring in my high school year, I decided I wanted to join the Air Force. So I went to one of the storefront recruiting offices and I took some minimal exams, and they said, "Well, I'm sorry, your eyes are not good enough. You can't join the Air Force." Okay, so fast forward, I go to Camp Dodge and they assign me to the Air Force. Well, what could be better? But here it was, a buck-ass private. I was making $21 a month. When I think about it, and Roger 3, he's concerned about making $25 an hour, and we were making $21 a month. So how times change. So they sent us off to Shepherd Field, Texas for our basic training. And this is in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is a big base, 30,000 people there. And again, we take more tests. We do lots of physical exams. And they were obviously were trying to send, where are they going to send us to? Are you going to be a truck driver? You're going to be a stenographer? You're going to go and be a mechanic, whatever. And at the time, I was making $21 a month, and I saw the guys at the end of the field flying. I said, "You know, I really would like to go and be a flyer, not instead of doing some other job for the Air Force." So I asked my sergeant, "Could I take the test?" And he said, "Oh, sure." Well, fortunately, I passed the test, and a few weeks later, I was on my way to Lincoln, Nebraska. And at Lincoln, it was they sort of stacked up the cadets, and so it was a pre-flight at the University of Nebraska. We lived at a new dormitory, new library they made into a dormitory for the pre-flight people. We had maybe 5 or 6 missions on a little Piper Cub to go and orientate us with flying. We took courses in history and world affairs, and they fed us well, and they had lots of physical education. Well, on October 23rd, they put us on a train. Again, you never know where you're going to go, but you get on a special train, and we headed west, fortunately. And in those days, we had troop trains, and we stopped, I remember, in Nebraska, and the ladies of the town were out in the platform getting sandwiches and cakes and all sweets for us, which was a very nice thing to do. They were very supportive. So we get off to so we end up in Santa Ana, which was where Disney is now. Again, it was a base of 30,000 people. And again, we took more tests, more physicals, and were you going to be a pilot, a navigator, or bombardier? Well, I really was sort of thinking of a pilot, but I was so happy when I became a navigator. And again, we spent about, this is October, November, December, until January. And unfortunately, in those days, we got Christmas off and you got New Year's off. Well, Christmas Eve, my Aunt Jean took Dave Eason and I to the Coconut Grove for a lovely evening. And on New Year's Eve, we went to the USO in Hollywood, and they gave us the name of a nice couple, or I guess not a nice couple, picked us up from Bel Air. We spent the night, and they gave us a couple of tickets to the Rose Bowl, which was very, very nice. So we went back to the base, and in January, let's see, is it January? Yeah, January or February 3rd, we get on another train, head for Kingman, Arizona. And this was going to be for our gunnery school. And we were from a very peace-loving family. We never had a gun in our home, never had a gun in my hand. Well, here we had 50 caliber machine guns we were learning to fire. We had a 45 pistol we learned to fire. And they put us on a truck, back end of a truck, and we go and have skeet shooting around the base. It was a terrible weather at Cayman, but we spent 2 or 3 months there learning learned how to be a gunner. We would have a B-17, we'd go up in another plane, and we'd fire at a sock behind the B-17, learn how to go and fire the gun, learn how to take the gun apart. And one day, when we're through our duties, about 5 o'clock, they said, well, you're free. You can go home, and in 2 weeks, report at Hondo, Texas. But you take your navigation. Well, I said, I want to get the hell out of there as soon as I could. It's so miserable. And in Arizona, the temperature was about 30 degrees. It was misting. And I grabbed my bag and get out on the highway and start hitchhiking. And fortunately, some nice farmer, there was gas rationing, there was not much traffic, but some nice farmer on a pickup truck put me in the back end and took me to Winslow, Oklahoma. And in those days, TWA had a flight from Los Angeles to Winslow to Kansas City to Chicago to New York. And so I got in the Winslow about 10 o'clock, and fortunately there was a midnight flight out of Kansas City. So I got on a plane off to Kansas City, then a train back to Davenport for a couple of weeks, then down to Hondo, Texas. And in Hondo was our navigational training. And we spent 4 months there learning all the things you're supposed to learn as a navigator. Now, why do you need a navigator? They don't have navigators anymore. Well, you only need a navigator to go and find out which way the wind is blowing. If you find out which way the wind is blowing, you can find where your plane's location is. And so you lived by the stars, your celestial navigation, you had dead reckoning on by the ground, and you had many other ways you learned how to go in radio. You learned radio, you learned weather patterns. And after about 4 months, they sent us off to Lincoln, Nebraska. So they gave us another leave and report back to Lincoln, Nebraska, where we met our crew. And Our pilot was Chuck Lawrence, a 25-year-old recently married guy from, I think, Long Beach, and very jovial guy, very nice guy, and a good pilot. The co-pilot was Frank Lively. He was a jazz friend from Dallas, and he was also recently married, but he was a good pilot and nice guy, very easy to get along with. The crew were the Iowa farm boy, Pittsburgh, a guy from Pittsburgh, a guy from West Virginia coal mines. Our tail gunner was a sort of a nut. He was on his second tour, very tiny little guy, and loved war, all crazy things. And so we met our crew, and then we went again on a train off to Ardmore, Oklahoma, where we spent 3 or 4 months, and preparing to have missions, combat missions, learning how to go and what the idea was, and get crew to mesmerize, and getting used to the B-17. And so then we go up to, after 3 or 4 months, we get up to Lincoln, Nebraska again. And on mid-November, again, put us on, then we don't know where we're going to go, whether the Pacific or England or Italy. So in mid-November, we get on a plane and on a train again, head for Fort Dix, New Jersey. And we get in Fort Dix again, 3 or 4 days. Then one day about 5 o'clock, this is, we'll get ready to go. And see, that date was November 21st. They said, okay, ready to go. And they put us on a bus again and take us to the ferry. The ferry goes across the Hudson. And my God, there's a Queen Mary waiting for us. Some nice Red Cross ladies giving donuts and hot chocolate. And we get on the Queen Mary, which was obviously a huge float at the time. And instead of a cabin for 2, they're a cabin for 12. And again, as officers, we ate in the main dining room just 2 meals a day, a late breakfast and early dinner. But we had all the fine silver, the fine china, the waiters, the white jackets. It was really very charming. There were 20,000 soldiers on board, and the poor enlisted men, they were 24 hours on deck and 24 hours down in the hold with very little ventilation. Still, it was a miserable life for them, but it was only 5 days. They didn't have an escort because they were so fast, and hopefully there weren't any U-boats to go and sink us on the way over, which of course, they had unbelievable carnage of the boats. The German submarines would knock so many of them out. But we get off to Gurrick, Scotland, and unload and get on a train, get off to Rattleston, which was our base in England. Again, the base was just an old wheat field, which they bulldozed, and 2 years before, they made an air base. They had all Nielsen huts. We lived in Nielsen huts, which were corrugated steel corrugated steel homes or whatever they were. And we had a coal stove. There were 6 of us in the cabin, 2 crews, and we were about a half a block from the mess hall, and half a block to the Johns, and about a block and a half to the mess hall. And it was okay. We got there, and after about 4 or 5, we got there late December, early December, and again we did some preliminary to get us acquainted with the B-17 and combat conditions. We spent a week or so getting acquainted over England. And one day, let's see, December 15th, I think, they shook my bed and said, "Oh, there's a navigator time for you to get up and go, 5:30 in the morning." This is my first mission, and it was not with my regular crew. So so I get up and go to Hanover. Now on the missions, what you would do, they'd wake you up basically about 5:30. You'd go and have breakfast, and you'd come back and get dressed, and you'd have your long johns, you'd have your electrical flying suit, you'd have your then you'd go to the briefing. After breakfast, you go to the briefing. Now all the crews, all the officers would go, and you go to again another Nielsen hut, and they would have a big map in front, and the map would be covered, and the excuse me just a minute. And the information officer would go and lift the curtain, and wherever the mission was, everybody moan and groan, and then he would go and tell us, well, you're going to go and assemble at 22,000 feet over England, and you'd get over the coast at Ostend, Holland, and you would be at 28,000 feet, and there would be flak guns on your left, flak guns on the right, and you go 40 miles, and there's a couple hundred guns there, so avoid them. And they tell you exactly where the guns were supposed to be to avoid. And so we would we would continue to get dressed. We'd have our flak suits on. We'd have our heavy long johns. We'd put on our scarves. We'd have our mittens. And when you get on the plane, we'd have a Mae West. If we were to get over the sea, we would have our tied up to our our telephone. We could talk to everybody, and we'd have our have our oxygen mask on when you get over 12,000 feet. And excuse me, Smith. So then you would have your altitude. There'd be 36 planes would be in a form from each squadron. There are 90 bases within about a 40-mile radius here. And when you take off, everybody would take off at a similar time. We would take off every 30 seconds. You'd take off, and it was sometimes you couldn't see the end of the runway, and you go take off and go maybe 30 or 2 minutes straight ahead, then turn left and circle until you get to you could get out of the fog and into the clear air. Then you'd assemble, and every base would have maybe a 20-minute or half an hour difference, so it wouldn't run into each other. And then we'd have our way we would go and go across the channel on which number of formation you would be. And sometimes we'd all go to the same target. Sometimes you go to different targets. And we would, it was pretty exciting. It was very pretty up there with the contrails. And, but again, when the flak started coming, you're pretty goddamn scared. And when we were there, we had a lot of P-51 escorts. And so the Luftwaffe was pretty well beaten up, and that wasn't one of our problems, the planes. It was the flak that gave us all the trouble. And but we would have different altitudes, and we would go all the biggest raid was February 3rd was to Berlin, and there was over 1,000 B-17s. There was 561 P-51s, and So you figure that's 10,000 people up in the air at the same time, which sort of boggles your mind. Now they said, well, it was one of the good raids. We only lost 36 planes. Well, that's 360 people. It sort of boggles your mind that on a raid like that. And but again, you'd go and you'd go over your target, and when you have your initial point, which was when the bombardier takes over, I mean, where the bomb site takes over, and you have to go straight as an arrow for 2 minutes. They call it the initial point. You drop your bomb, then you go and pew to the left or pew to the right and get the hell out of there as fast as you can. And fortunately, we, in our flights, we only had our radio man was injured in the leg by flak, but that's the only casualty we had. I would say over a dozen flights, we came home with lots of flak on the plane, but we made it back every time. There's only once we were running short of gas and we had to land in Paris. So we landed in Paris and spent the night, gassed up, and then came back the next day. In England, it was a very, to go on these flights, sometimes you go 2 or 3 days in a row and you're so damn tired. All you do is fly and sleep and fly and sleep. And even the days you didn't fly, you were so damn tired, you spent a lot of time sleeping. We were a couple of hours north of London. Several times we had a chance to go and get to London, and they had a Red Cross units for us to stay in, dormitory type of facilities for $5. And the Grosvenor House, which is a very fancy hotel, was our officer's mess, which is very lovely. And it was just sort of fun to go around London with a blackout and all the historic buildings, and it was a very exciting time. I even went to the London Symphony and went to the art galleries. And after 45 missions, I became a first lieutenant. They also gave me a flak leave, and that was just, which is just a week rest. I went to a town called Bournemouth on the southern coast, and again, just mainly slept and walked on the beach and came back and finished my tour. When I finished my 35 missions, I had my choice of going back to the States, but I heard about, and then possibly going off to Japan on B-29s, which didn't particularly appeal to me. And I don't know how I did, but I heard about the Mosquito Squadron of the 25th Bomb Group, which was Elliott Roosevelt's first outfit. It was a reconnaissance. They did a lot of special things, special bombing, special chaff missions. They put the tinfoil on before the bombers to screw up their radar. And the Mosquito was a pilot and a navigator, and it was a fun plane to participate in. I had a pilot, Roger Gilbert, and Roger Gilbert is a couple years older than I was, but he was from Des Moines, Iowa, and so we became great friends. And we spent, I'd say maybe just a dozen times we flew in maybe more. We did no combat missions because the war ended, but we were able to go and fly all over England and had a lot of fun. When he came back, I was best man at his wedding, and he went on to stayed in the Air Force and became the commanding general of the Iowa National Guard, which is very interesting. Well, after the Mosquito stint, we waiting to go home, and with my 35 missions, it was pretty high priority. So on the last of July, I was able to go and get on the Queen Elizabeth going home, and came into New York on August 1st and dashed off to, again, led us off to New York, get into Camp Dix where we were before, and they had big steaks for us and all the milk we could drink. And there was Gene Krupa and Anita O'Day to greet us there in a big show. And we spent 2 or 3 days there. Then we went home for a month, and we didn't. Then, can you imagine trying to discharge 16 million men? I mean, for about 14 million men in a short time. Well, they just always sent us to Jeff Barracks in St. Louis for a couple of months, and then they sent us to Tampa, Florida, and just waiting for the bookwork to get done. And on at the end of October, I was able to get discharged, but I was with our 25th Bomb Group. Mosquito outfit was going to go and photograph the world, which at the time I was making maybe $200-300 a month, which is big money in those days. And I was ready to stay in. And so I called my dad. He said, "You get yourself out of the Army as fast as you can," because he saw that when in a peacetime Army, it depends upon Congress. And sometimes they have a lot of fun, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, they just go and discharge unbelievably, unmercifully, people who say they're going to go and stay 20 years, and at the end of 15, they're out with no pensions or very little pensions. So I dashed off, and the day I got out, I flew to Ithaca, the last day to register for Cornell, and this time they took me. So the life goes on from there, and here I am after all these years. But it was a very exciting time for a young man. I was 21 years old. Is he 21? 21 years old, flying over Berlin, 30,000 feet on Roger's birthday of all things, February 3rd, 1945. Well, that's the end of my story.
That's a great
Questions?
Great story. Can I ask you a couple questions?
You may.
So, you know, you talked about some of your missions. What were some of your targets? I mean,
here's my list right here. Just by chance happened to, but our first target was December 15th in Hanover. It took 6 hours and 40 minutes. I went to Koblenz, Mannerheim, Dürgen, Worms, Frankfurt, Karlsruhe, Berlin, Wessel, Nuremberg.
And were you hitting munitions? What were your target?
No, we were our actual target. I mean, basically, mostly our targets were rail centers. We tried to disrupt their rail centers, except on Berlin and Dresden and some of these other towns. We tried not to hit the center of towns. As a matter of fact, on the Berlin raid, General Doolittle was our commanding general, and he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to go to Berlin. He said, "How are you going to kill all these civilians?" And he was overruled by Ike and all the other and his bosses, the head of the Air Force over there. So Britain bombed the cities. They bombed at night and just bombed the hell out of the cities. They said, "We're going to get the morale back down." But we said we want to have more of a pinpoint bombing. It was almost impossible to finish. Okay, I have another thing to say here. Some more things to say. But let's see. On February 3rd, on that raid, there were 1,000 B-17s, 515 P-51s. There were 15,000 men in the air, which sort of boggles your mind.
Yeah.
Now, there are 43,000 planes overseas, over 43,000 planes overseas. 23,000 were, no, they said, no, 43,000 planes lost, were bombed, lost. 23,000 lost in combat, 14,000 planes were lost in the States with accidents and for things in the States. Now, when you figure this out, that during the war, there were 170 planes per day lost. That's in training and combat and overseas. There were a total of 220 soldiers, sailors and Marines lost per day during the war. 220 per day lost. Now, in 1942 and 43, it was impossible to finish 25 missions. You figure you have 5% loss per mission, and you have 25 missions, that you just couldn't do it. Memphis Bell was the first plane to finish 25 missions, so they made a big deal out of it. Now, let's see. In the Marines, three times as many people were wounded as killed. In the Air Force, 3 times as many were killed as wounded. So it's quite those interesting figures. Any more questions?
Well, yeah. You kind of glossed over the end of the war. Do you remember where you were when you found out about it?
I was riding my bicycle on a bicycle in the countryside of England, and we were not at a place where we could celebrate. We just isn't exhausted, so they're just very tired. We were very tired. So, but again, I guess I was in Wanton, wasn't I? In the war, yeah, I was up in Wanton. We were very relaxed, but I grew up in a home with a Methodist home, and no drinking, no smoking, and so I wasn't into the bar with the boys. Most of them. There's a lot of drinking and and they give they give a lot of cigarettes to everybody. So I wasn't into that type of thing. It's very interesting. Well, my family was interesting. That I had an older brother, Ken. Ken was in college at Michigan State in hotel school, and he was in the RWC in the quartermaster corps, and so he got a second lieutenant quartermaster corps, and he was assigned to run a officer's mess in Paris, which was good duty. But unfortunately, weren't